text, John 18 and verses 12 through 14, please. Then the cohort, even their chief and the officers of the Jews together, arrested Jesus and bound him. They brought him first to Annas, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was the high priest at that time. And Caiaphas was the one who had given counsel to the Jews that it was advantageous for one man to perish for the people or for the nation. So if we would see what the trial of Jesus in fact was, we must begin by seeing what injustice it ought to have been. So let me give you a little history here. This comes from the Mishnah. Now remember the Mishnah, we talked about it in our messages concerning the men against Christ, where we saw the Pharisees and scribes as one group, then the Sadducees as another group, and then the chief priest and the high priest and the priest as another group. We did 3 separate messages, and we saw how each of those groups was threatened by the Lord Jesus Christ because of the ministry he had, and they didn't want to lose what they had in Israel, if you please. But when we come to the Mishnah, we talk about the Sanhedrin. Okay, the Sanhedrin. Whenever there was a trial that was going to lead to what we call a capital trial of national and supreme religious importance, they were carried out by a group called the Great Sanhedrin. Now, the Great Sanhedrin was 70 men, and they had the high priest, whoever the high priest was at that time, would be the 71st member, and he'd just sit there like our vice president sits over the Senate of the United States in America, all right? So you have 70 members. Now, this is patterned after Moses in Numbers chapter 11, verse 16, where he chose out 70 men to help him judge and rule over Israel. So it included the high priests, scribes, Pharisees, priests, Sadducees, and elders of the people, okay? Elders. The key is this, when we look at why the Sanhedrin was put together. The key is this, that everything was deliberately arranged and ordered to protect the person that was accused of the crime. In other words, the Sanhedrin, folks, they were the defense attorneys. Okay? The defense attorneys. So they're assuming innocence until proven guilty. And that's how it's supposed to be in our court system. All right? They're assuming that. Now, what I found was interesting, kind of tickled me because of our social distancing. Even here we have the chairs 6 foot apart. Well, in the Sanhedrin, they also had their chairs 6 foot apart. And the reason for that was so that they couldn't kibitz and share opinions during the course of the trial. They had to each of them make up their own minds, you see, as we looked at that. So they were looking at things in terms of mercy. In other words, mercy in judgment. So they acted as the defense counsel, as I said. Now, what happened was this. There were witnesses that were brought in. There had to be at least 2 witnesses to whatever the crime was. And that's from Deuteronomy 17:6. Where the Lord told Moses to have at least 2. All right, 2. So, no arguments concerning the trial could be made until the witnesses gave their testimonies. And what's interesting is this. The witnesses were brought into the room one at a time. So one witness couldn't listen to another witness, say, and change his idea about what's going on. So one at a time is what happened here. And then, as the argumentation came between the prosecutor and the Sanhedrin here, who were the defense attorneys, all right, when that finished, then the same witnesses, no matter how many there were, but there had to be at least 2, were brought in again to give testimony again, one at a time. And so there could be notice if one changed his testimony, he was excused and his testimony was stricken from the records. All right? So it was very profitable for the person that committed the crime who was considered innocent till he could be proven guilty. All right, if you notice that. So when we go to John, we're in John. Let me just give you an example of something. John 19, or 18 rather. Here we are, John 18. Notice with me verses 19 through, through 21. Now, I'm going to give you the steps of the trial here in a second. But what we find in 19, verse 19, then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Now notice, the high priest, he was first brought in verse 13 to Annas, who was not the high priest. So there was a movement here between verses 13 and 14 and verse 19. He's now brought to Caiaphas, okay? The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus replied, I have spoken publicly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple courts where all the Jewish people assembled together, and I have said nothing in secret. Nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Now, I'm going to say this to you. Hang in here with me. This is a point of law. Caiaphas, the high priest, had no right to question Jesus before the witnesses came in. All right? So this is something that we notice. Ask those who heard me what discourses I had with them. In other words, ask the witnesses. See? They know very well what I said. When he had said this, one of the officers standing nearby slapped Jesus on the face and demanded, is that any way to answer the high priest? And then Jesus goes on. He says, if I have said anything wrong, testify concerning it. But if I have told the truth, why do you hit me? See, so even when the Sanhedrin had this law from the Mishnah, and right here we see it's not being adhered to, okay? Not being adhered to. Now, one other thing before we actually get into the steps of the trial, and that is this. The witnesses appeared, as I said, at the beginning and at the end of the trial. Now, if the man or woman, whoever it was found guilty, and there was capital punishment, in other words, stoning took place, it was the witnesses who brought forth the testimony of the guilt that threw the first stones. All right? You remember with the woman taken in adultery in John 8? Who's ever without sin among you, let him cast the first stones. Well, that's what we have here. All right? So they would cast the first stones. Now, this is interesting, and I'm not going to go back here. But in Genesis 4:10, if you remember the story of Cain and Abel, Cain killed his brother Abel. Then God comes to Cain and says, where's your brother? He says, am I my brother's keeper? And then God says to him, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Do you remember that? Well, that word blood there in the Hebrew is plural. So this was, you say, what does that mean? Well, hang in here. It's very important that we understand that when Cain killed Abel, Cain just didn't kill Abel. He killed his progeny, those that would come after him. So in the Jewish mindset, the Sanhedrin is the defense. The man has to be considered innocent until proven guilty, and those that prove him guilty, the witnesses, are going to be the one that execute him. All right? Execute him, and not only him, but those that come after him, would have come after him. So it's a very serious thing. And in fact, in the history of Israel, we don't read about anybody being executed that way. That's how important it was. And it was also this, that there could not be a unanimous decision among the Sanhedrin. That was against the law. You have 70 people, somebody had to see it differently, at least one, in order for the verdict to come out yay or nay. See, okay? So that's important as we go on to look at this. Also, one more little point, that when the Sanhedrin met, they met at a place called the Hall of Hewn Stone. It was just outside of the temple. That's where their meeting place was. Now, let me bring in now to the trial of Jesus. So in the four gospel accounts, we talked about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we find that in the 12 hours leading to the cross, that Jesus underwent a trial that was broken into 6 separate divisions. 6 separate divisions. And I believe it was done for this, because the experience he went through was calculated to exhaust him physically, to benumb his mind, to drain his emotions, and to break his spirit. Remember, who is doing this? The men against Jesus that we've already talked about. They hated him. They wanted him gone. And not just gone, they wanted him destroyed altogether. But the wonder of it is that our Lord Jesus Christ emerged from this terrible ordeal unbroken and unbound. So what are we looking at then? Well, the 6 parts of his trial begin with Annas. Verses 13 and 14 here, and we've already read them in the book of John, chapter 18, 13, and 14. Now, Annas was not the high priest, as the scripture declares here. But in the days of Israel's independence, in other words, when they weren't under the thumb of another government like they were now, they were under Roman rule. But in the days of their independence, the high priest was put there and given that office for life. But when it came to the, when they were dependent on other countries, right, the high priest revolved. And it depended on political, and economical situations. In other words, men would buy their way in. Now, Annas was important because he had 4 sons, 2 of which had been high priests and 2 who will become high priests. And Caiaphas, who we're going to see next, he was the son-in-law of Caiaphas. Now, you say, well, why would Caiaphas be in the program? Because Caiaphas is the one that owned all the tables in the court of the Gentiles where the Jews went to buy their offerings, for any feast, the 3 feasts that they had to appear before the Lord. And so what we find is this: when the Lord overturned the tables, whose money was he taking away? Annas's. See, he was the Don of the high priest. Like in the mafia, you see, he was the head guy. So they took him to him first, all right, as you see this. So, he arranged then for Jesus to be brought to him that he might gloat over Jesus and his downfall. The second one we see has to do with Caiaphas, verses 19 to 24, and we already read these, but notice verse number 24 in John 18. Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So he goes to Caiaphas here. That's also found in Mark 14, Luke 22, Matthew 26, verses 57 and 58. But what I note here, and I see, is that this was to be, now remember this was to be an official meeting before the Sanhedrin. But the Sanhedrin is supposed to meet where? In a building called the Hewn Stone. That was their courthouse. But they didn't do that. They were meeting in Caiaphas's home. So we don't even think 70 of these Sanhedrin were with these folks. So in the days of Jewish independence, this would have been the end of the matter. As soon as they started something at Caiaphas's house, it would have been declared by the lawyers as void and null. But of course it wasn't. Now the Talmud says this: 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the judgment of capital cases and causes was then taken away from Israel. So Israel did not have a right to put somebody to death or declare them guilty to a death penalty. Y'all follow that? So that's what we see then with Caiaphas. So when we see the Sanhedrin, which is the 3rd section, they were to carry out the official trial. But notice with me Luke. Come back to Luke with me, please. And chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. And let's notice, please, verses 66 through 71. 66 Luke 22, 66 to 71. And as it became day, the elders of the people were gathered, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away into their Sanhedrin, saying, "If you are the Messiah, say so." But he answered, "If I should tell you, you will not believe it. And if I should question you, you will not answer me, nor will you release me. From now on, the Son of Man shall be sitting at the right hand of power of Elohim." Then they all said, "Are you then the son of El? Are you in the right?" Answered he, "For I am," the Lord says. On this they yelled, "What occasion have we for further evidence? For we ourselves have heard enough from his own mouth." But wait a minute, where were the witnesses? See, a man could not be accused or found guilty by his own testimony. If he was a prisoner, had to be witnesses. So the Sanhedrin then is breaking protocol right here. So you have Annas, you have Caiaphas, and then you have the Sanhedrin. And all three of them broke the protocol for trials within the Jewish nation here, all right? So what is the next step? Well, the next step is to bring him before Pilate. So notice chapter 23 here in Luke, verses 1 through 5. And rising, the entire group of them led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man subverting our nation and forbidding us to pay tribute tax to Caesar." I can stop at every one of these and tell you where he didn't do that. In fact, one time he told Peter, "Go catch a fish, take the coin out of his mouth," remember? And pay the taxes, okay? And claiming that he himself is Messiah, a sovereign, in other words, a king. So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the sovereign of the Jews?" He replied, "You say so." And Pilate said to the chief priests and crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they persisted in saying, "He incites the people by teaching throughout all Judea. It started in Galilee and ended up here." Now, as soon as he says it started in Galilee, what happens in Pilate's mind? He's going to send him to Herod, because Pilate had no jurisdiction up there in Galilee. Okay, so he's going to send him on to Herod. So when we get to verse number 6, now Herod Antipas is who we're talking about. Notice verses 6 through 12 with me, please. This is the 5th trial. And here in 4 before Pilate and before Herod, we have what we would call official jurisdiction, because they're looking for a capital punishment here, so death. Now, verse 6 says this, down through verse number 12 is where we want to go. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was extremely pleased, for he had long desired to see him, having heard much about him, and expected to see him perform some miracles. But though he put many questions before him, he gave him no answer. And the chief priests and the scribes stood fiercely accusing him. You can see him screaming. I mean, just picture it in your mind here, what's going on. Then, laughing to scorn the claims of Jesus, Herod and his soldiers with him made sport of him, dressed him in the luxurious clothing, and sent him back to Pilate. And from that very day, the enmity that had been between Pilate and Herod ended in friendship. So Herod Antipas, he was given the title of king by the grace and favor of the Romans. That's why in some translations you read King Herod, you see. But there's no verdict by Herod. He didn't make any verdict at all, as Pilate did not. See, not at all. Therefore, the responsibility then is going to flow back to whom? To Pilate. Okay? Going to flow back to Pilate. Now, I'll just say this to you. The completion of the trial before Pilate is going to be the message next week. And the reason I'm doing that is because there's a reason that Pilate submitted to the wishes of the Jews. And that's going to take more than 10 minutes to explain to y'all why he did that. I mean, why would he do it? He was the Roman governor. See? But there were certain circumstances in his life wherein he submitted to taking Jesus and say, yes, you take him and crucify him. All right? But the main events of the Jewish tribe, the Jewish part of the trial, in their search for evidence, is found in Matthew 26. Come on back there. In their search for evidence, come back to Matthew 26, if you would. Let's begin in verse 59. All right. 26, 59, and we'll read down through 63, first part of 63, verse 63. So in 59 it says this, and the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were trying to get false testimony against Jesus in order that they might have him executed. Now what is wrong with that? What was the purpose of the Sanhedrin, as I showed you? They were supposed to be the defense attorneys. They were to act in mercy. But what were they doing here? They were trying to find false witnesses, false testimony against Jesus, in order that they might have him executed. But they could not find none. But they could find none. Although many false witnesses came forward, at length there came two. So they listened to many of these false witnesses. But two came in that might have made sense to them. Who said, this one declared, I can destroy the temple of Elohim and build it in 3 days. Did Jesus say that?
No.
No, he didn't. When we go to John chapter number 2, Jesus said, you destroy this temple, I can raise it up. A temple made not without hands. Say, he was talking about himself. And that might be what the allusion is here. Okay? 62, and the high priest rose up and said to him, have you nothing to answer to that charge they bring against you? Jesus, however, remained silent. Now, why would he do that? Because they're out of line here. And they have no authority over him, trying to accuse him in this at all. Okay? So, when you look at this, you have to keep that in mind. It was based on John chapter 2, verses 18 to 21 with the temple statements, is what we see. But the second thing that they try in Matthew, beginning in 63, the end of 63 here and through 68, is this. Again, the high priest addressed him in the name of the ever-living Elohim. He said, now I put you on your oath. Tell us whether you are the Messiah, the son of El. I am he, Jesus answered. Yet I tell you that from this time on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right of power and coming on clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his garments, saying, he blasphemed. Why do we have any more need of witnesses? Behold, now you have heard his blasphemy. Who heard the blasphemy? The Sanhedrin. You've heard that. What do you think? Now they, answering, said, he is guilty of death. Then they spat in his face and struck him, some with fists and some with open hands. So now the Jewish authorities saw it. They had their chance. Blasphemy. Treason against God is what blasphemy is. Okay? So Jesus must die. But there's some things that we have to notice here. I have 7 things that I've written down in relationship to this trial business. Number 1, the preliminary trial was set against the prescribed procedures of the Sanhedrin. They were to be defense attorneys, not those prosecuting him. Number 2, the witnesses did not agree. Mark 14 tells us no 2 witnesses agreed at all. Number 3, Jesus was assumed to be guilty before any evidence was given, and that was against the Sanhedrin. Twice he was subjected to physical violence before he was found guilty. Luke 22:63, and also John 18:22. The questions that were asked him were designed so that if he did answer them, they would make him guilty or incriminate him. Okay? Number 6, the Sanhedrin did not meet in a subscribed place of the hall a hewn stone. So it was illegal in that respect. Number 7, his rights as a prisoner were systematically destroyed. And if you can remember those messages we did on men against Jesus, you'll remember how each group hated Christ and for what reason, and wanted him totally destroyed. And the whole gospel account revolves around what? Their desire to destroy him. Okay? Their desire. Now, we're going to get shortly in our Sunday school lessons on why Israel did not recognize Christ and why they couldn't get into their hearts and minds why he was the Messiah. So what do you conclude with today? 3 things stand out about Jesus. Number 1 is his dignity. He was in total control of his person. And even though it was a long 12 hours, they tried to destroy that in him, he did not succumb to it. Number 2, we see his courage. He gave his answer to the high priest knowing it meant his death. But he did it anyway because he knew who he was. And I think the reason he did that, and we've talked about this in the past, remember this, Jesus was a man, was he not? He suffered as a man. And even his whole lifetime, he was subject to temptations, etc., etc. And everything that you and I have gone through in life, he experienced. All right? However, his complete confidence in his ultimate triumph and in the glory that lied beyond the cross, I think, was in view. And you'll catch that if you go back and read Isaiah 52 and 53. Even though it's laid out there about his suffering, there's ultimately there the glory that will follow. And you see that in John 17 when the Lord is praying to his Father. Return to me that glory. And he knew, because the Father told him, I have already given it to you. So he knew that. So that's the first part of the trial message. Now next week it'll slow down a little bit because it's going to be with Pilate, you see. And what Pilate understood was going on, and blasphemy could not be brought to Pilate. Although that's what the Jews brought. He wasn't interested in that. That was not a governmental thing. That was a Jewish thing with their religion. Okay? So we're going to see how Pilate's going to react to all this, and we're going to see why he ultimately submitted to allow Jesus to be crucified. Right? And I hope you'll join us for that.